what do we really know about the roles of women in military intelligence? Their legacy has often been obscured, and that's why I'm so delighted to be speaking today with Colonel Mel Emmett, and we're going to be sharing the secrets of women in intelligence for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. Colonel Emmett, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're most welcome.
So we're going to discuss the roles of women. I'm really looking forward to this, and really to ask you, is it true? I mean, women have always been involved in some aspect of military intelligence. I mean, we think of the women of SOE, for example, and of course we know a lot about that. But can you tell me something about the women in military intelligence?
So for starters, the SOE is a really interesting area for intelligence, because I think a lot of intelligence purists would see them as focused on subversion and sabotage. So operations really, with intelligence from their work being a byproduct of it. But I will leave it at that. So to go back, I suppose it would be unrealistic to say that women have been involved in every level of the gathering and the focus of intelligence, because of course the role of women in society over the hundreds of years that we might be focusing on intelligence has not been equal to men. But I think it's fair to say that because war and conflict affect whole societies, how can you not have women being involved in some respect? And indeed, you might say that conflict affects women and children disproportionately compared to men. So in that respect, I think we have always had women involved, whether it be Queen Elizabeth I setting up her diplomatic network. And indeed, I think there was a Chinese empress who set up her own security service. So there are moments in history where a female leader has been able to set up a structure, but hasn't actually been the focus of intelligence necessarily, or indeed the collector or analyst. But as we come and perhaps look at the Great War and World War II, then we start seeing, of course, the SOE, but perhaps the most prominent example is the thousands of women who were involved in code breaking and signals interception at Bletchley Park, and I think that lots of people will recognise that. But they were also at Trent Park as well, doing a slightly different job in the Y service. And I know as we come through to more contemporary history, or modern history, I should say, we start seeing women moving out of just being contained in signals intelligence and perhaps aerial imagery analysis, to working with human intelligence collection in Northern Ireland, surveillance, because of course how can you have a natural looking surveillance team if it's only a load of white young men? It looks like a military setup. And indeed, it's more than human intelligence and surveillance. I think as we get closer and closer to today, you see women being the analysts in all domains, particularly supporting brigades on ships, of course, now that the Navy has their own established intelligence branch, and of course supporting the Air Force from air bases and indeed overseas, and indeed on aerial collection platforms. Now I've drifted from a predominantly civilian structure supporting military operations to very much a more modern day look at military, so soldiers and officers supporting military operations, but of course we still have plenty of women in the civilian security services supporting both military operations and the needs of the government of today in terms of our own security apparatus, which obviously includes the police as well.
So when we think of those civilian agencies, we think, of course, MI5 and MI6 is recognisable. But of course, as we know, historically the MIs are MI1 to MI19, of which women took part within those. But of course, that was hugely not only dominated by men, but founded by men. Do you have a perspective you want to share on that?
Yeah, it's it's the nature, again, of society, isn't it? That it has taken time for society to modernise and certain parts of society to accept the validity of the skill set that women can bring. Not that it's necessarily any different, but that there is a validity and there is a competence and a whole part of the human resource structure of the human race that isn't being used. So it's been good to see that that has changed over time. And perhaps in a way disappointing when you think of female monarchs who were forward thinking, and yet society hasn't caught up really until the 20th century, certainly not in the UK. I mean, I think that's hugely dismaying, and one wonders what we might have achieved or what we might have avoided had we been a more inclusive society. However, much that is negative has been said, and I would much rather focus on the positives. And indeed, we could look at MI5, as it was named, the security service, particularly looking at the great Stella Rimington being the first Director General, and then Eliza Manningham-Buller coming after. Those two women had a real impact on me because I joined the army in the late 90s. So it was just after Stella Rimington. And so when I was thinking of joining the military and indeed the intelligence corps, she was the first public female figure working in intelligence that I had seen in a grand way. And in many respects, that's her legacy, isn't it? That she was the first Director General to be publicly announced, and that she brought that service out of the shadows, not in any way to undermine the work that they're doing, but to allow the public that they protect to understand that this is an organisation made of human beings with capacity, with skills, who need to recruit and need to shrug off the image of boys' club, I think she referred to it as, and to be much more accessible. So that's wonderful. And then, of course, just after 9/11, Eliza Manningham-Buller takes over and revolutionises this organisation in terms of structure. So where I suppose Stella Rimington is about openness with a small o, perhaps, Eliza Manningham-Buller, I think, takes this organisation. I think they grew by about 50% with the government's support, of course, after the attacks on the World Trade Center, noting the surge of Al-Qaeda activity thereafter and the war on the global war on terror. It's wonderful to see a woman at the helm of that organisation recognising that an organisation that, of course, was essentially overseas looking anyway, but had to have a much better network, much better finance, much better structured. And I think she's interesting because she grew up in that organisation as an intelligence practitioner, but had also led in the finance department's the development of technical intelligence. So there is a leader who is an all-rounder in terms of being a practitioner, but also being a manager and someone who can understand the future of intelligence as well. So two wonderful women to start my career with, even though they're not ostensibly military intelligence.
Yeah, and having a vision. I mean, they had to be visionary, didn't they, to be able to adapt and change a very traditional organisation. And if we think of the other one, which is so, much in the public consciousness, MI6, or originally the Secret Intelligence Service as it's also known, do you think there's a reason why they've never had a female head? I mean, do you have a view on that?
It's a really good question, but I think it's one that it's not fair for someone from the military to comment on, I suppose, the human resources decisions of another organisation. So I can only speculate. But what I would say is that there is something interesting about the security service being very home-oriented and MI6 being very foreign-oriented. We've had female Home Secretaries. We don't have very many female Foreign Secretaries. And it's interesting when you look at, say, the success of perhaps less so Hillary Clinton because she can be so divisive, but Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State,
Yes.
what a powerhouse from our greatest ally. Why isn't that bleeding into the leadership of our government and our security apparatus? And I fundamentally don't have the answer to that question, given that there is a rich history of female involvement in intelligence. What I would say, though, that I think is very positive is in the last 3 or 4 years, both the SIS and GCHQ have made a real effort on their recruiting front to try and attract women. And it's not just looking at schoolgirls and university graduates, it's women of all ages who may have skills to bring into these organisations. And I think that's wonderful because they are specifically targeting women in order to be able to make people see that there is a place for them, where it perhaps happened by circumstance. Take the example of the women at Bletchley Park. Well, there wasn't a workforce. The male workforce had gone away. Where are we going to get our workforce from? We need hundreds, we need thousands. There were lots of women who were available, who were anywhere from very low skilled to very, very highly skilled and being taken out of universities for that work. So we need to move beyond that circumstantial position. And I suspect they will get there. I would love to know, I would love to be inside the heads of the current Director Generals, and I'm sure that they will have as much of a plan for female leadership as the armed forces all very much have at the moment.
So actually from my own research, just when you were talking there reminds me of kind of women starting to do stuff. Well, even, certainly in the First World War and in the Second World War, I discovered, for example, that the Naval Intelligence Section were the first, currently in declassified files, to use female interrogators. It's like, oh my goodness, smashing the boundaries. And they had a particular skill set that was recognised. So this is what I wanted to ask you on the back of that. In what sense do you think, in terms of the military intelligence picture and intelligence gathering, that we've used people who are suitable for the job rather than it being a gender issue? Do you think there is an element of that?
I think there has to be. And we have to be very honest that there are differences between the genders. What I think we have to be very careful of is generalisations. Not all women are a particular way, not all men are a particular way, and thank goodness that's the case. But and I made a reference to surveillance earlier, it's very difficult to have a very homogeneous group conducting certain kinds of operations. Now, of course, it would look weird in some settings to have a woman present, but in some settings it would be weird not to have women present. We've had female engagement teams in Afghanistan that have been on the news. Now, they weren't specifically intelligence gatherers, but they were groups of women who would go out and talk to groups of women. And indeed, from my time in the Congo, we recognise that where women have been brutalised by a male armed force, the last group of people that they want to be debriefed by is military men. So you have to have women involved in certain things. Then there are other situations where perhaps you can gain a different kind of relationship with a woman. And again, I'm going to be very, very careful here because I think it's very easy to make generalisations, but we make assumptions about the people that we work with or the forces that we work against. So, for example, in my first tour in Afghanistan, we decided that I would be used in a human intelligence scenario to conduct what we know as key leadership engagement with a male target. And a lot of people assumed that, well, he's an Afghan, he won't want to talk to a woman. But of course, in some settings, when you get two men together, there is a sense of competition. And we can't get away from our who we are as a species. But if you put a woman into that environment, you may get, not always, but you may get a slightly different effect.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's curious because it goes against all the assumptions, and in many respects, sexism is actually quite useful when gathering intelligence because you're not seen as much of a threat, maybe not given the credibility that you might deserve, or there is an atmosphere that may be created between two people or two different groups whereby you're just able to get a different kind of access, create a different impression. And I think we've just got to be really careful about, whenever anyone is planning any kind of operation, whether it's a security operation, a military operation, you look at the tools you have, don't you? You look at the vehicles you've got, the weapon systems, the operational context, and you assign the right kit to the right circumstance. Well, your people are exactly the same, whether they be women or men, whether they've got different language skills, whether they're great at generating a particular kind of conversation, whether you want to have a slightly threatening impact, whether you want to actually go out and have a very dynamic, kinetic engagement, you will use your people differently. And so it goes back to that point that women have always been involved, but we might have been able to achieve more had we had a more diverse intelligence gathering cohort, because you need as many different types of tools in your toolbox as possible.
Yeah, for me that's something I'd not thought about before, and so important, isn't it? What would have been the impact if women had been used differently or earlier? And do you think there is a difference in the way women approach intelligence roles and analytical skills, or is that just, again, getting down the gender issue?
Yeah, it's a super common, because I just think it's something that lots of people pick up on.
Yeah.
And again, it's not intended to be sexist at all, is it? That we think of women being perhaps more detail-oriented, more cautious. There's probably an element of truth in that, but again, it's very easy to generalise. So I would say there are some women who are better. I'd love to say, yes, of course, we're all better, that's the case, but that would be completely wrong. There are some women who are better at that sort of thing. There are some men who are better at that sort of thing. The only difference where I've seen a consistent pattern, and this must still not be a generalisation of how our people work, is in social interaction. So lots of people will make the judgment that women have higher EQ or emotional intelligence, and it's a very easy thing to bandy about. And there probably is a modicum of truth in that. But I think there are more women who are able to manage a relationship because of their personal self-awareness and the subtleties that come from that. Now, of course, there are plenty of men. Most men are able to manage their own social interactions. But I think because of the cultural context within which we grow up and the way we behave, that it's a hindrance, because I think there are a lot of women who lack the confidence to be able to push themselves and to be ambitious enough. But in a way, the lacking of confidence makes them a little bit more cautious. The bolder people tend to be men, and I think that's why our armed forces have been so successful, because there is a role for traditionally male behaviour in fighting, and traditionally female behaviour has a value of its own. And I've met some true warriors in the military, but there is a value in cautiousness, healthy scepticism, in intelligence, I think, that just enables us to be as effective analysts, and different kind of analysts. It goes back to that idea of diversity again, doesn't it? You need some hard charges, you need some cautious approaches, but you don't need people at either end of the spectrum. You need a mixture in the middle to produce a really good product at the end of the day.
And I think also when we think of the roles of women, which we're talking about today clearly, we think often of their bravery. I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning, the legacy is often obscured by the roles in SOE, the Special Operations Executive. obviously there were other situations in history where women have been incredibly brave, and I'm thinking now behind enemy lines, moving away from the analytical stuff. Do you think there is a difference in, because I've been asked this myself, and I have an open mind on this at the moment, do you think that women who've been involved in those military intelligence or intelligence behind enemy lines historically are braver than men, or do you think it's something within human beings and some of us are brave and some of us aren't so brave?
Oh, the question of bravery, I think, is something that the military talks about quite a lot. Our view, generally speaking, is that everyone starts with a certain amount of bravery, and over the course of particularly military operations and situations where one is in contact in a battlefield, that bravery depletes and you can't really replenish it, which is why you end up seeing people who have been through so many contacts, been in so many situations of perceived or actual threat that they just can't go back out into those environments. It's not that they're not brave, it's that they've been brave too many times and there's no way to replenish it. Now, to a degree, experience, maturity, training all help the decisions that we make and perhaps the bravery, but I still think there's two slightly different things there. And so I'm not sure that people are brave or not brave. I do think that there is something wonderful about the human condition, that we are so open to being trained, to making great things of ourselves and to believing in the values and standards that make us successful, that take us a little bit further on the battlefield. And I think what human resource specialists would call discretionary effort, the thing that takes you beyond the bare minimum, and that's where we really create battle-winning success. So I don't think there is a gender difference, but I do think there is a difference in the opportunity people have. So how are we brave until we can't go looking for an opportunity unless you're particularly odd, or maybe stand on a street corner for, to rescue the people from an RTA or something. I think it's a question of you're in a situation, something happens, and then you choose to do something about it or you don't. I suppose, particularly in the world wars, men had plenty of opportunities to be brave. I wonder, and I don't know because I wasn't there, I wonder if women felt it was more important to take that opportunity when they could, because this was their way, not just to give birth to sons who would go out and die for their country. That's not a hugely rewarding contribution. To maybe go and be in Bletchley Park would be wonderful, to be part of the first aid nursing yeomanry, for example. There's plenty of ways of doing it, but if you had language skills, if you had a canniness, if you had technical skills, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to use those? So I do wonder if there was a greater imperative, not to prove ourselves, but to seize the opportunity when it came along. Certainly in my military career, I've seen no difference whatsoever. Possibly it is the case that being a female soldier, being a female sailor and an airman means that you have to prove yourself to be taken as seriously as the men. But I think that's a feeling that's disappearing now, which is wonderful.
So do you see any roles for women that haven't been taken up so far in terms of intelligence, military intelligence? Are there things which you feel women should be doing but we haven't quite reached there yet?
I think in the sense of military intelligence, and I can't speak for the specifics of how the agencies work, although I do know women are operating right across those agencies. In terms of the military, I think great things have happened over the last 40 years, but particularly the last 5 or 6 years. I think the modern armed forces have been very able to adapt to women operating in intelligence much, much earlier than women were really taken seriously in other regiments and corps and trades across the other services. And I suppose the greatest example of that is, again, our human intelligence and surveillance in Northern Ireland, where women were operating on exactly the same level, being put in exactly the same degree of danger, risk, and contributing really meaningful intelligence. And you look at what was going on in the 1970s and the 80s for the rest of the Women's Royal Army Corps, and it was nothing like as dynamic. Now, that's not to say that women weren't contributing, they absolutely were, but they were not able to have the same opportunities as I think we always were with intelligence. It really ought to be one of our great recruiting pitches, actually. But of course, in a way, that's been negated by the fact that all trades have been opened up right across the army. And I think that creates other opportunities, and particularly with perhaps the special forces as well, when we get more and more women through infantry and other frontline training, they will then perhaps be better able to go and compete on those courses and be able to be employed in the special forces. And again, that's obviously about operations, but we do need intelligence gatherers in that group as well. So that's probably the last operational area. The only other thing I would say is we talk a lot about collection, collation, analysis, and to a degree dissemination. But the start of the intelligence cycle is about direction. And for direction, we have to have women in positions of leadership. And that, I think, is where we continue to grow. But I would say that there is still much work to be done. Only this year did we promote our first woman to brigadier in the intelligence corps. And then that's a wonderful thing. But it took...
Being 2021.
2021 was the first year. Was the year in which we had our first brigadier promoted. And that's quite late compared to other cap badges. Why is that? I can't answer without being perhaps too candid. But I think there is much more work to be done there. We have had female senior soldiers. We've had the Corps Regimental Sergeant Major, the senior soldier in the Corps. We have had women in that position, but not for a while. We've had female Regimental Sergeants Major, but we don't have very many of them. So I think there is, although the trades, I think we have resolved that to a greater or lesser extent because we've been so good at that historically. There is something about the direction bit of the intelligence cycle which needs, we need to recruit women, but we need to retain them. And we need to retain them through their childbearing years, and although families are not the only thing that gets in the way of a woman wanting to stay in the military, plenty of other things do. But we need to get them experienced, skilled, with a real depth of skill so that they are convincing as leaders and managers. And that is where I have particularly focused my efforts over the last few years.
I have to ask you, do you have a favourite heroine of your own?
Ooh, gosh, there's so many to choose from, and it would be very easy to say that the soldiers and the officers of the Intelligence Corps would probably be my first. But that aside, could I pick three? Would that be terribly rude, or is that too long?
Pick three, yes.
I'll be quick. The first one is an individual, and I think we all talk about the SOE, and everyone knows about Violette Szabo, parachuting into Limoges on D-Day to sabotage German communications. And I think there's something very compelling in her story, because here is a very dynamic, very brave woman who is doing something relatively unusual. So that is hugely uplifting. The second one is a team, and it's the women at Bletchley Park. Because there were thousands of them, and because the success, it's very easy to focus on the technical brilliance of Alan Turing, and thank goodness we do celebrate that now rather than how he was treated in his lifetime. But it's the hard work of thousands of people to make sure that that code breaking is done. It's not about the brilliance of an individual, and sometimes history focuses on the individual at the expense of how important a team is to creating success in an intelligence environment, because a lot of it isn't glamorous. It is hard work, and it's dull, and it takes time, but the impact can be magnificent. And the third one would be Queen Elizabeth I. And as someone who loves structures and networks, I really value the diplomatic network that she set up with Walsingham, whereby she used her ambassadors not just as ambassadors of English trade, but also to be collectors in their own right, that she and Walsingham took English students out of colleges and universities and embedded them in a variety of European cities to be able to report back on current events. And then thirdly, to use this broader network to be able to disseminate deception, misinformation, and part of that probably held back the Spanish Armada from our shores for longer than we might otherwise have had without them. Now, it would have been lovely if she'd been able to employ more women in that network, but I think if we're talking about that particular era, women were not educated, they were not at universities, they were not going to be part of any diplomatic circle, so perhaps she didn't have that choice. But for the structure and network that she set up, that is now the foundation, the precursor of all our security apparatus, I would say Queen Elizabeth I.
Oh, and there's that wonderful dress, isn't there, with
Yes,
the eyes and
yes.
the ears?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, wouldn't it be great if we all had one of those?
Yeah, fabulous. Just want to ask you about your own career. When you look back at your career so far, have there been particular highlights that you'd like to mention?
Yes, but it's strange actually, having talked about the women who we have discussed today, I sort of feel I've had a wonderful career, and I don't think I would change much other than to perhaps make it a little bit more exciting. I've no idea how I can compare my work over the last 23 years with the work of all these women who've come before me, whether they be in the at Bletchley Park, at Trent Park, the SOE, in the security service, or the SIS and GCHQ. So I feel really humble actually that my work has been very much about just supporting military operations, and it has been phenomenal, and I'm very lucky to have had the opportunities that I have. I joined as a rather ill-informed 21-year-old, went through Sandhurst and was deployed to the Balkans almost straight away, and out on the ground straight away.
Wow, yeah.
But it's great, isn't it, that we take young people, we give them training, when we take people with the kind of values and standards that we want, we train them, we instill the values and standards in the military context, what they actually mean in the military context, and then we give them crazy amounts of responsibility. But that's what we live for, isn't it? That I was able to go out and engage people and Kosovans and in a variety of settings, other allied armies I was working with as well, and I was still wet behind my ears and didn't really know what I was doing, but thank goodness any junior officer is always given a wonderful experienced senior NCO to support them, and that's what's so great, is that whatever I've done, I've always worked alongside some truly brilliant soldiers. But what I would say is I think there's a misperception that you have to be intelligent to be an intelligencer, and I don't think that's the case at all. Of course we want Oxbridge graduates, but in all the things I've done, I've worked with people who come from very humble backgrounds and actually have experience of the darker side of society, and that's what we work with. So it's great if you're very lucky and you come from a privileged background, and we need that. But sometimes that's actually more useful in our civilian security agencies than it is with the military, who are there on a bad day to engage with and destroy Her Majesty's enemies. And so I look back on my career where my life hasn't been full of general warfare, thank goodness, but there have been moments, and those moments where we're desperately scrabbling around for information and the right collection platform, and we always want more assets, because you can never give an operational commander too much intelligence. They will always want more. We're always the last to switch the lights off in any operational headquarters, and quite often those lights never go off. But I take great pride in that everything we do, it's about the soldiers on the ground. It's about making sure that they're as safe as possible, that they know what they're going into, and that for starters, that they're doing something that has meaning, that the operation that they are conducting has been led by intelligence that is directing the decision maker, the operational commander, to go and deliver an effect that has meaning to the wider battle, the wider operation that the government wants us to conduct. And I've been hugely fortunate that I've worked in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I've worked with the UN in the Congo, very different experience. I worked in lots of different types of trade, and I think that's why I've been so lucky. I've got a pretty low boredom threshold, and the nature of intelligence is such that if you want to be detailed and you want to be a specialist and you want to spend years building up skills, you can do that. If you want to perhaps skim the surface of a few areas and become more of a manager of a collection portfolio, or designing the dissemination structure that really makes our intelligence useful, you can do that as well. So I've been able to go to different theatres. I've been able to work with just about every allied army you can think of. I've always had a sense of moral purpose, and I understand how difficult that is for some people, and perhaps some people watching this podcast, that sometimes our moral purpose is not that clear. But when you think about, I'm not going to involve myself in what the government seeks to do. The government has made that decision, and I'm not saying we're pawns of that at all, because fundamentally Her Majesty is our boss. But when we think about the role of intelligence, is to make sure that the right soldiers go out of the right door to do the right thing, and that if a kinetic effect is required, that it is directed at the right targets. And, you know, you can't fault a career where you've worked with, thankfully, much better people than I, to be able to deliver something meaningful. It doesn't always go right, and those days are days that stay with all of us, and as they probably should. But there've been some terrible dull days, and there've been some awful, dreadful days where we've seen our friends killed. And there have been some brilliant days where we've worked with great people, we've met wonderful people, we've met terrible people, but have been able to have a interesting result. And I couldn't have asked for more than that.
So can I ask you a final question? If you had your career all over again, would you still have joined the Intelligence Corps? Would you still have been one of these women in intelligence?
Undoubtedly. There is nothing that I would want more. And actually, looking back, when I joined the army, I don't think I really understood what I was getting into. And although I had thought about intelligence work, I didn't join the army to do intelligence. I wanted to join the army. I wanted to be a soldier, and I wanted to have responsibility and variety. Thankfully, there were people in and around the Royal Academy at Sandhurst who knew far better than I and spotted that I might be suited to it. So every part of the armed forces has value, otherwise it wouldn't exist. But I don't know where else I could possibly have had the variety, the satisfaction, and the most extraordinary diversity of soldiers to work alongside. I've been very lucky. And I would encourage anyone thinking of this, thinking of joining the army or thinking of intelligence work, to consider the Intelligence Corps and our sister branches in the RAF and the Navy, because there is something, if you want purpose in your life and you want meaning and you want a little bit of action and you want something where you can genuinely have an impact, then this is not a bad place to stop.
Colonel Mel Emmett, thank you so much for such a dynamic and fascinating talk and for sharing with us the secrets of women in intelligence.
You're so welcome, and actually for my part it's really lovely to be able to recount some of what I have seen and the people I've worked alongside, to make sure that we do capture the history of women in intelligence. So I'm actually really grateful to you. Thank you.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.